For as long as I can remember, my grandmother has always been happy about the arrival of her grandchildren. She invited us to visit and gave us presents, but about 6 months ago, in early January, everything changed. Grandma started calling and asking us to take her to her place because she was already old and it was hard to live alone after the death of my grandfather 2 years ago. My parents decided that my grandmother would not be a burden to them. She's kind and a good hostess. I live separately on a rented apartment, but in my parents' apartment, there are 3 rooms. There is enough space for everyone. When my father went to pick up my grandmother, it turned out that he was too late. She'd already died. I'll skip the details of the funeral and New Year's holidays. I'll just say that since then, my father has become somewhat withdrawn. In early May, I started asking my parents if we would go to my grandmother's house this year. After all, it has been empty for 6 months. Suddenly, it was looted. But my father categorically refused to go there and even forbade me. When he did not want to explain the reasons, I decided not to tell my parents anything and went to the village with my best friend so that they would not notice anything. We took drinks, some meat for kebab, and cash with us. On the approach to the village, we had to turn off the road onto an inconspicuous highway. It was about 15 kilometers to the village itself, but we didn't meet a single car or person along the way. It was June 15th, but the village was quiet. No summer residents, no locals, no cows. And the store appeared to be closed, even though it was right at the entrance. Everything looked abandoned, though last summer, life was bustling. Along the way, I began to notice oddities. The gates and doors to the fences at many of the houses were either open or broken. Fortunately, Grandma's house was fine, though the yard was overgrown with grass and the gazebo roof had collapsed. I found the key in the familiar place and went inside. We laid out our things, cleaned up a bit, but by evening we were tired and decided to rest. Walking around the village, I began to feel uncomfortable. The silence, the broken gates, the empty streets. Something was wrong. When we got back to the house, the door was wide open, things were scattered, food was lying on the floor, and the kebab was gone. I can't describe exactly what I felt then, fear or anger. I took an axe and walked around the property, but found no trace of the visitor. I decided to ask the neighbors if they had seen anything strange. My friend stayed behind to guard the house. When I returned an hour later, I knocked and called out to him, and he opened the door, clutching a chair as if he were preparing to hit someone. He was pale, breathing heavily. He told me that he heard someone come into the yard right after I left, and then he started yanking the doorknob, trying to enter without knocking. Then there was silence. And half an hour later, I came in. Later that evening, sitting in silence, we heard one loud knock on my bedroom window. We just looked over at each other, too scared to check. An hour passed. It was getting quite dark outside. Suddenly the car alarm went off, breaking the silence. It seemed like someone had set it off on purpose to get us to get out. After half an hour, the annoying sound stopped, but soon resumed again. We sat and listened to someone quietly wandering around outside under the windows, rustling branches. We were barely breathing. When the rain and thunder began to fall, the rumbling drowned out all sound, turning the long, anxious night into an eternity. By morning, it was still dark, and a thick fog covered the village, preventing us from leaving. When the fog cleared, we cautiously exited the house, clutching the axe, and ran to the car. Only when we saw other cars on the highway did we feel safe. I haven't discussed the trip since. Later, I asked my father if we would go to the village this summer. He replied glumly that it was not necessary. He said, let it be a memory, and we would not sell the house. I don't know what happened in that village. But I know one thing. I won't go back there again. I'm going to tell you an obscure story that happened to me. I usually live in an apartment building on the 6th floor with windows overlooking the courtyard. Last fall, while sitting at home on vacation, I got into the habit of drinking tea while watching the sunset behind the houses. This harmless habit helped me to see a strange phenomenon, Dot. At sunset, tired, I increasingly looked out into the courtyard at the bustling people, the houses around, and so on. One evening, when the sun was already behind the houses and not blinding my eyes, I noticed a figure with a white oval face in one of the windows of the house across the street. Someone was also looking into the courtyard from the 4th floor. The next day, at the same time, while I was drinking tea, I saw the figure again and looked at it more closely. Apparently, a child was sitting at the window. The proportions of the figure and some details led me to this conclusion. I thought that the child was probably sick and looking out the window, watching the more fortunate peers playing soccer in the yard. Dusk thickened, and I didn't see the figure again. Remarkably, the light in that window and the neighboring ones never came on Dot. As darkness fell on the 3rd day, my gaze involuntarily searched for the silhouette in the window, and there it was again. I remembered that all this time the child had not moved, and I was somehow confused by his eyes. Of course, I could not see them because of the distance, but, in the place where they should have been, there were unpleasant, frightening shadows, as if there were no eye sockets, but dark hollows. On the 4th day, I was out, and on the 5th day, I asked my neighbor for binoculars. After sunset, the figure was still visible motionless in the window. I pointed the binoculars at it and could not get the right focus. I could see the windowsill, the frame, but the figure remained blurred. It seemed that the child was not sitting directly at the window, but a little farther away. Nevertheless, after the episode with the binoculars, it began to seem to me that the dark recesses of the eyes were looking solely at me. I began to draw the curtains and went into another room, but my curiosity persisted. The next day, I peeked out from behind the curtain to see that the figure was still there. Mind you, to my observation, the light in that window also never came on. Not in the evening, not at night, not in the morning. All of this made me extremely agitated. I don't know why, but I went out into the yard and started walking in front of the neighboring house where this window was located. From the street, unfortunately, I couldn't see anything in the windows because of the reflection of the evening sky. I figured out what apartment number the windows corresponded to. It was apartment number 16. My feet led me to the entrance, where I froze in front of the intercom, hesitating to dial the number. Struggling with feelings of stupidity and curiosity, I stood there until the door opened and an elderly couple stepped out. I took that as a sign, said hello politely, and stealthily made my way inside. When I got to the 4th floor, I came up with a cover story in case the usual residents opened the door. I would say that I had mixed up the entrances. I stood there, stomped for a while, took a deep breath, and pressed the bell button. Nothing happened. I didn't even hear the bell outside the door. Disappointed, I looked at the door, hoping to get something from its appearance. Then, for some unknown reason, I pulled the doorknob and the door opened. It was unlocked. As if in a dream, I found myself standing in front of the doorway of the apartment. I was a brave enough person and had been in such places that I could declare to myself that I was not afraid. But at that moment, I felt an unusual thrill that I cannot remember in my entire life. I realized that I couldn't help but go in, trying not to attract attention or give myself an excuse to back out. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The layout of the apartment was odd, and I started fumbling around the wall for a light switch. I finally found it, but the light didn't come on. Apparently, there was no electricity in the apartment. I moved by feel to the rooms. First, I looked in the large living room. It was brighter. The unshaded windows let in some light. The room was completely empty, with only the floor, ceiling, peeling wallpaper, and a thick layer of dust where my footprints were visible. It became clear that the apartment was abandoned, and I realized that the mysterious silhouette was in the far room where the corridor led Dot back in the hallway. I moved cautiously along this corridor. The door to the bedroom was closed, and pushing myself to the extreme, I was ready to see anything behind the door. With an unpleasant creak, I opened the door and stepped into the bedroom. There was no one there, either. The stripped walls, a light bulb on a wire hanging from the ceiling, and a child's desk near the window, quite old. On it, on a dense layer of dust, someone had written with a finger, "I see you." The inscription was fresh, otherwise it would have been covered with dust. An inexplicable fear seized me. A shiver ran through my chest and goosebumps covered my back. I grabbed my head to catch my breath and looked around again. Only my footprints were visible. It was already dark outside, and the apartment was unusually cool, though I noticed at first that the heat was on. The thought, "Leave quickly," came clearly into my mind. I pulled a chair over to the table and hurried out, feeling someone's eyes on my back. As I sprinted out onto the lighted landing, I came face to face with an elderly woman peering out of a neighboring apartment. She was clearly confused by my appearance and the fact that I was in an abandoned apartment. After coming to her senses, she closed the door, leaving a slit, and told me that this apartment had been for sale for a long time. I asked what had happened to the last tenants, to which she said she didn't know anything, but there hadn't been any tenants for a couple of years. I hadn't seen the mysterious silhouette in the window since. I closed the curtains and sank into my thoughts. The next evening, the figure was gone, as if it had never been there. A week later, I looked out the window again, but I saw nothing new. All that remained were questions and the strange feeling that the unknown and frightening were always there.